There is a lamp sitting on my fireplace mantel. It is not much to look at. Black steel, scratched and dented in places. The glass clouded from years of use. Most people who come into my house walk right past it without a second glance. My daughter Claire once offered to clean it up for me, maybe put it somewhere less noticeable. I told her to leave it where it was. That lamp went down into the earth with me every single day for 35 years. It lit the way when there was nothing else down there but rock and dust and the sound of other men breathing. The day I walked out of that mine for the last time, I carried it out with me like it was something precious. Because it was. I am 68 years old. My name is Raymond Calloway, though nobody in Harlan Hollow has called me anything but Ray since I was about 9 years old and got into a fist fight with Tommy Breeden behind the schoolhouse. I won that fight. For what it is worth. Not much. Probably. Tommy Breeden moved away decades ago, and I doubt he remembers my name at all. I live alone now in the house my wife and I shared for 31 years. It sits at the base of the mountain, back off the road a little, surrounded by trees that have already gone bare for the winter. The mornings here are cold enough to hurt. I do not mind the cold. Not usually, but my lungs mind it plenty these days. Every morning I wake up before the sun. Not because I want to. My body just does it. 35 years of early shifts will do that to a man. I lie there for a minute in the dark, listening to the quiet, and then the coughing starts. It is not dramatic. It is just there. Like a neighbor you never invited, but who shows up every morning anyway. I sit up, breathe slow, wait for it to pass. Then I get up, put on my robe, shuffle to the kitchen, and start the coffee. The doctor, his name is Paulson, young fellow, drives up from Beckley twice a month to see patients here. He told me 3 years ago that I have what they call coal workers' pneumoconiosis. Black lung, the old miners call it. Have called it for generations. It is not a new disease. It is not a surprising diagnosis for a man who spent 35 years breathing in coal dust underground. When Dr. Paulson told me, I nodded and asked him what I needed to do. He looked at me like he expected me to react differently. Maybe cry. Maybe argue. Maybe ask him if he was sure. I did not do any of those things. I had known something was wrong with my lungs for years before he put a name on it. The coughing had been getting worse since I retired. Some mornings it felt like trying to breathe through a wet wool blanket. There is no cure for black lung. Once the dust is in there, it stays. What you can do is manage it, slow the progression, keep the inflammation down, protect what lung function you still have. Dr. Paulson gave me a list. Inhalers, morning and evening. A daily breathing exercise, 10 minutes of slow, controlled breathing. Something like what I imagine people do in those yoga classes I have seen advertised on television. No cigarettes, which was not a problem since I quit smoking at 42. Avoid cold air when possible, which is a fine instruction to give a man living in the mountains of West Virginia in November, and avoid stress. Dr. Paulson said that one carefully, like he was not sure how I would take it. I took it fine. I just did not always manage to follow it. I do the breathing exercises every morning at the kitchen table while the coffee brews. 10 slow breaths in. Hold for a count of 4. 10 slow breaths out. I count in my head. It gives my mind something to do besides think about things I cannot change. Some mornings it helps. Some mornings my lungs feel like two fists clenching, and no amount of slow breathing makes much difference. But I do it anyway. That is the only way I know how to handle anything. You show up. You do the work. You do not complain about it. My wife Maggie used to say I was the most stubborn man she had ever met in her life. And she said it the way you say something that is both a criticism and a compliment at the same time. I think she meant it both ways. I miss her every single morning. Not in a sharp way anymore, not the way it was the first year after she passed. It is more like a dull weight now, something I carry without thinking about it. The way you stop noticing the weight of your own coat after you have been wearing it long enough. She has been gone 2 years this past October. Some mornings I still reach for my coffee cup, and for just a half second, I think I hear her moving around in the bedroom. And then I remember. And then I drink my coffee. There are certain things you carry up from underground, and there are certain things you never manage to bring up at all. I did not understand what that meant when I was young. I thought I was talking about coal. Maggie and I met at a church social in the summer of 1979. I was 22 years old and had already been working in the mine for 3 years. She was 20 years old and had just finished 2 years of community college over in Bluefield. She was the prettiest girl in the room and she knew it, but she did not act like it, which made her even prettier in my opinion. I was not good at talking to women. I am still not particularly good at it. But something about Maggie made it easier. She asked me questions and actually listened to the answers. Not many people do that. She wanted to know what it was like underground. Most people asked that question and then flinched a little at the answer, like they were expecting something dramatic. Maggie just listened with her chin in her hand and her eyes steady on mine. We were married 11 months later. My mother thought we were moving too fast. Maggie's father thought I was not educated enough for his daughter. Neither of them said anything that slowed us down even a little. We moved into a small apartment in town first, then saved up and bought this house when Derek was 2 years old. I remember the day we moved in. Maggie walked through every room, touching the walls, like she was making sure they were real. Then she stood in the kitchen and looked out the window at the mountain and said, quietly, like she was talking to herself more than to me, that this was exactly right. This was exactly where she wanted to be. I have thought about that moment many times since she passed. The way she said it, the certainty in her voice. Maggie always had that certainty about the things that mattered to her. I never had that kind of certainty about anything except her. Derek was born in 1982. Claire came along 6 years later, in 1988. 2 kids, different as weather. Derek was restless from the time he could walk, always wanting to be somewhere else, always looking past whatever was right in front of him towards something further away. When he was a teenager, he talked constantly about leaving Harlan Hollow, getting to a city, making something of himself. I never told him not to want those things. I just did not always understand them. Claire was different. She was quiet the way Maggie was quiet, comfortable inside herself, not needing a lot of noise or movement to feel alive. She loved this house, loved the mountain, loved sitting on the back porch in the evening watching the light change on the ridge. She reminded me of her mother in ways that were sometimes hard to look at directly. especially after Maggie got sick. Those years when both kids were young and Maggie was healthy and the mine was still running full shifts. Those were good years. Hard, but good. I worked long hours and came home tired and dirty, and Maggie had dinner on the table, and the kids would tell me about their days, and I would sit there listening and thinking, without ever putting it into words, that this was enough. This was more than enough. I did not say that out loud very often. That is something I wish I could go back and change. Not the big things you cannot change anyway. Just those small, ordinary moments when I could have said something and did not. Because I assumed there would always be more time. There is always less time than you think. The mine I worked was called the Harlan No. 4. It closed in 2008, 2 years before I was planning to retire anyway. By then I had enough years in for my pension, so the closing did not ruin me financially the way it ruined some of the younger men. But there was still something strange about the ending. 35 years of going down into the same earth, the same tunnels, and then one day it just stops. They board up the entrance, and that is that. I went out on my last shift, came back up, handed in my equipment, all except the lamp. The foreman, a man named Grady Sims, who I had known for 20 years, looked at me when I kept the lamp and said nothing. He understood. Most of the men took something from their last day, something small, something that had been with them down there. You needed a piece of it to take with you, because you could not explain to anyone who had not been down there what it meant to spend that much of your life underground. I brought the lamp home and set it on the mantel, and Maggie looked at it and smiled and said it belonged there. That was the last good year before she got sick. The year after the mine closed, she started having trouble breathing. Ironic. Maybe, given my own lungs. Hers turned out to be her heart, a condition that had been building quietly for years without announcing itself. The doctors in Beckley did what they could. For a while, she was stable. Then she was not. Those last 2 years of her life, I did not leave the house much. I did not need to. Everything I needed was right there, keeping her comfortable, keeping her company, making sure she had what she needed. I cooked, which I had never done much of before. I learned. You learn what you have to learn when the person you love needs you to. Derek visited sometimes. Claire visited more. But it was mostly just Maggie and me, the way it had been mostly just us for a long time. The kids had their own lives. That was how it was supposed to be. I do not regret a single day of those 2 years. They were hard days, but they were ours. What I did not know, during all those quiet days sitting beside my wife, was that there were things happening that I was not seeing. Things I should have known about. Things that were being kept from me, for reasons I did not yet understand. I found out later, the way you always find out too late, and all at once. The winter Maggie got really bad was the winter of 2018. She had been declining slowly for about a year, but that November something shifted. She started spending most of her time in bed. The walks she had been taking around the yard stopped. The kitchen, which had been her place, her territory, really, from the time we moved into this house, became somewhere she only visited for short stretches, sitting at the table while I made tea, her hands wrapped around the mug for warmth. I watched her get smaller, not just physically, Though that too, she lost weight she could not afford to lose, and her clothes started hanging off her in ways that were hard to look at. But it was more than the physical. It was like watching someone turn down a lamp, degree by degree. Still there. Still herself. But quieter in some fundamental way. Like she was conserving something. She never complained. That was Maggie. She had never been a complainer. Not in 39 years of marriage. She had a different way of dealing with hard things. She got very still, very focused, like she was gathering herself inward. I had seen her do it when the kids were sick, when money was tight, when her own mother passed. That same stillness. I used to think it was strength. I still think it was strength, but I have also come to understand that it meant she was carrying things inside that she never put down in front of me. I did not always know what to do with her stillness. I am not a man who knows how to fill silence gracefully. So I did the things I knew how to do. I made sure she was warm. I made sure she had her medications. I sat beside her bed in the evenings and read, or sometimes just sat without reading, because she seemed to like having someone nearby even when neither of us was talking. Derek called during that time. Not as often as I would have liked, but he called. He lived about an hour and a half away by then, in Charleston, with his wife Sandra and their 2 kids. He had a job in property management, something I never fully understood the details of. But it seemed to pay well enough. He drove down some weekends to see his mother. Those visits were good for Maggie. Her face changed when Derek walked through the door. She lit up in a way that she did not quite light up for anyone else. He was her firstborn. There is something particular between a mother and a firstborn child that I think exists outside of logic or fairness. It just is. Claire was living in Morgantown then, working as a nurse's aide at a care facility there. When Maggie got really bad that November, Claire asked her supervisor for extended leave and drove down and stayed with us. She slept in her old room and helped me with Maggie's care during the days. Having her there was a relief I did not know how to express out loud. So I probably did not express it at all. Claire knew. I think. She knew me well enough to read what I did not say. Those months had their own rhythm. Medications at certain hours. Dr. Paulson's visits twice a week. Quiet evenings. Maggie sleeping more and more. Claire and I moving around each other in the kitchen. Keeping things running. Not talking about the thing we were both thinking about, because saying it out loud seemed like it would make it arrive faster. My own health was not great that winter either. The cold air was getting to my lungs worse than it had in previous years. I was coughing every morning and some evenings too. And there were days when climbing the stairs to check on Maggie left me standing at the top catching my breath. Which was a strange thing needing to recover from walking up a flight of stairs in my own house. I did not tell Dr. Paulson how bad it was getting. I did not want to deal with it. I had other priorities. In February of 2019, I got a phone call that I was not expecting. It was from a man named Gerald Perkins. Gerald was a retired school teacher who had lived 3 streets over from us for about 20 years. Good man. Quiet man. The kind of neighbor who waves from his driveway and brings over a pie at Christmas, and otherwise minds his own business, which in Harlan Hollow is considered a virtue. Gerald called on a Tuesday afternoon while Claire was upstairs with Maggie. I answered in the kitchen, not thinking much of it. I assumed he was calling to ask about Maggie, the way people did. He was not calling about Maggie. He was calling about a loan. Specifically, a loan that he said he had made to my son Derek 3 weeks earlier. A loan that Gerald had agreed to because Derek had told him that I was aware of it and that I would serve as a guarantor. I stood in my kitchen and listened to Gerald Perkins tell me this. And I felt something happen in my chest that had nothing to do with my lungs. I told Gerald, as calmly as I could manage, that I did not know anything about any loan, that Derek had not spoken to me about it, that I had not agreed to guarantee anything. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Gerald said quietly that he was sorry to have bothered me, that he would handle it himself. I put the phone down on the kitchen table and stood there looking at it for a long time. Through the ceiling, I could hear the faint sound of my wife's voice, talking to Claire. Maggie's voice had gotten thin that winter, like paper, but I could still hear it. I did not go upstairs right away. I stood at the kitchen table and I looked at the lamp on the mantel in the next room, and I thought about what I was going to do. I already knew what I was going to do. I had always known, when it came down to it, what I would do when someone crossed a line I had drawn. The question was not what. The question was when, and how much it was going to cost me. It cost me more than I expected. It always does. I called Derek that same evening. Claire was still upstairs with Maggie. I waited until I heard the television come on in Maggie's room, the evening news, which Maggie had watched every night for as long as I could remember. Even now, when she could only half follow it, and then I went to the back porch with my phone and closed the door behind me. It was cold out there. The kind of cold that comes down off the mountain in February and settles into your bones before you even know it has arrived. I could feel it in my lungs immediately, that tightening, like someone slowly turning a valve closed. I should have gone back inside. I did not go back inside. Derek answered on the third ring. He sounded distracted, like he was in the middle of something else. He said, "Hey, Dad," like he always did. Casual, easy. The way a man sounds when he does not yet know why you are calling. I did not waste time getting to it. I told him Gerald Perkins had called me. I told him what Gerald had said. Then I stopped talking and waited. The silence on Derek's end lasted long enough that I knew everything I needed to know before he said a single word. An innocent man does not need that much time to find his surprise. When Derek finally spoke, he did not deny it. That was the one thing I had not fully anticipated, that he would not even try to deny it. He said he had meant to tell me. He said it was temporary, just a short-term thing. He was going to pay Gerald back within the month. He had not thought it would be a problem. He said it like he was describing a minor administrative oversight rather than something he had done deliberately, using my name, without my knowledge or permission. I listened to all of it. I let him finish. Then I told him, in a voice I kept very level and very quiet, that what he had done was not a small thing. That Gerald Perkins was a neighbor I had known for 20 years. That my name in this town was not something he had any right to use. That, in Harlan Hollow, a man's word and a man's name were the same thing. And he had borrowed mine without asking and spent it on something I knew nothing about. Derek started to say something about how I was overreacting. I told him not to finish that sentence. Then I told him we were done talking, and I ended the call. I stood on the back porch for another few minutes in the cold, breathing carefully, trying to keep my lungs from seizing up on me. The mountain was black against the sky. No stars that night, too much cloud cover. Just darkness and cold, and the sound of the wind moving through the bare trees. I had made up my mind. I was going to cut Derek off. Not in anger. Not in the heat of the moment. I had thought clearly enough about it in the time between Gerald's call and Derek's to know that this was the right decision. A man who would use his father's name without permission, who would go to a neighbor and speak for me without my knowledge, that was not a small character flaw. That was something that ran deeper. And I was 65 years old with damaged lungs and a dying wife, and I did not have the reserves left to keep absorbing the consequences of other people's poor character. That was where I was when I went back inside. What happened next was not something I had planned for. I came through the back door into the kitchen, and Claire was standing there. She had come downstairs for something, a glass of water, I think, and she could see from my face that something had happened. She asked me if I was all right. I told her yes. She looked at me the way her mother used to look at me when she knew I was not telling the full truth, but had decided not to push yet. I went to bed that night, certain about what I was going to do. I lay in the dark, listening to the house settle and the wind outside and the distant sound of the television still going in Maggie's room. And I thought about Derek as a boy, the way he used to wait at the end of the driveway when I came home from a shift, running toward the truck before I had even gotten the door fully open. I thought about that boy, and I thought about the man on the phone tonight, and I tried to find the connection between them. I could not find it. Maybe that was the point. Maybe people changed in ways you never saw coming. And the boy at the end of the driveway and the man on the phone were just two different people who happened to share a name. I slept badly. In the morning, I did my breathing exercises and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the light come up over the mountain, and I still knew what I was going to do. And then Maggie called my name from upstairs. Her voice was thin, but it carried. It always carried. Even at the end. I went up. She was sitting up against her pillows, which she could not always manage on her own anymore. Her hair was loose around her shoulders. She looked very small in that bed, in that room we had shared for so many years. But her eyes were clear that morning. That happened sometimes, days when the clarity came back fully, when she was entirely herself, sharp and present. And those days were both a gift and a kind of grief because they reminded you of everything that was being lost. She looked at me standing in the doorway and she said, "Ray, come sit down." I sat in the chair beside her bed. The chair I had pulled close enough weeks ago that I had not moved it since. She reached out and put her hand over mine. Her hand was thin and cool. I could feel the bones in it. She said, "I know about Gerald Perkins." I looked at her. I asked her how. She said Derek had called her the night before. After I had called him. He had called his mother, the way he always did when he needed someone to absorb the consequences of something he had done. I started to say something. She shook her head. She said, "I know what you are thinking. I know what you have decided. And I am not going to tell you that you are wrong. Because you are not wrong." She paused. Her breathing was careful. Everything was careful with her now. Then she said, "But I am asking you not to do it. Not yet. Not while I am still here." She said it quietly and simply, without drama, without manipulation. Just the plain truth of what she was asking and why. She said she did not want to spend whatever time she had left watching her family break apart. She said she knew Derek had done wrong. She said she was not pretending otherwise. But she said that whatever he was, whatever he had done, he was still her son. And she needed to know that when she was gone, Ray was not going to be alone in the world because of something that happened while she was still in it. I sat with her hand on mine, and I looked at the window and the winter light coming through it. And I thought about what it costs a man to undo a decision he has already made in his own mind. It costs something. It costs a piece of something you do not get back. But I looked at my wife. I looked at the bones in her hand, and the clarity in her eyes, and the way she was using what little strength she had to ask me for this one thing. I said, "All right, Maggie." She closed her eyes. Not in relief exactly. More like she had been holding something, and she finally set it down. I sat with her until she fell back asleep. Then I went downstairs and stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the lamp on the mantel for a long time. I had made her a promise. I intended to keep it. What I did not know, what I would not know for a long time, was that the promise I had just made was built on a foundation that was not entirely solid. That the story Maggie had heard from Derek, the story she had passed on to me in that room, was not the whole story. There were things she knew that she did not tell me that morning. I did not find that out until much later, until after she was gone, and the second thing happened, and Claire finally told me what she had been carrying since the day her mother called her into that room and asked her to carry it. But that comes later. Maggie passed on the 14th of April, 2019. It was a Thursday morning. The kind of spring morning that arrives in the mountains with a particular cruelty, bright and soft, and full of new green on the hillsides. Everything coming back to life outside the window while the woman in the bed was going the other direction. I have never quite forgiven April for that. I know that is not rational. I do not particularly care. She went quietly, which was consistent with everything about her. No drama, no drawn-out final moments. She had been sleeping more and more in the days before. And then one morning I came upstairs with her tea, and she was simply gone. Her face was still and peaceful in a way that faces rarely are in life. I stood in the doorway holding the cup of tea, and I understood immediately and completely, in the way you understand things that your body knows before your mind catches up. I set the tea down on the nightstand. I sat in my chair. I held her hand. Claire came up a few minutes later and found us like that. She stood in the doorway for a moment, then came in and put her hand on my shoulder. And neither of us said anything for a long time because there was nothing to say that was equal to the moment. The days after were the way those days always are, full of arrangements and phone calls and people coming to the door with food, which is the thing people do because it is the only concrete thing available to them. Derek drove down that same day. He looked genuinely stricken, which I noted and said nothing about. Whatever he was, whatever he had done, he had loved his mother. I did not doubt that. The funeral was small, the way Maggie had wanted. She had told me years before, on one of those evenings when people who have been married a long time talk about things they usually leave unspoken, that she did not want a big production, a few people, a few words, and then let her rest. We did it that way. After everyone left, after Derek drove back to Charleston, and Claire stayed one more night before heading back to Morgantown. I was alone in the house for the first time in 2 years. Alone in a way I had not been since before Maggie got sick, since before Claire moved back in to help. The house was quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. It had weight to it. I sat in the living room for a long time that first night. The lamp was on the mantel. The fire was going. I did not watch television. I did not read. I just sat there and let the quiet be what it was. In the weeks and months that followed, I kept my promise to Maggie. I did not cut Derek off. He called sometimes and I answered. He came down at Thanksgiving that first year, brought Sandra and the grandchildren, and we had dinner in this house, and it was fine in the way that things can be fine on the surface while something complicated is running underneath. I watched him across the table, my son, 41 years old, his mother 6 months gone, and I tried to find the thing Maggie had found in him, the thing that made her light up when he walked through the door. I found something, not the same thing, but something. I told myself it was enough. I told myself that keeping the promise was what mattered, not the feelings underneath it. I had made a commitment, and I would hold to it. That was what I knew how to do. My lungs did not improve that year. Dr. Paulson adjusted my medications twice. He told me the stress of caregiving and grief was accelerating things, which was not surprising, but was not particularly welcome information either. He told me again about the importance of managing stress, of rest, of not pushing myself in the cold. I nodded and told him I understood. Then I went home and did my breathing exercises at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the mountain and thought about Maggie standing in this kitchen 20 years earlier, looking out this same window, saying this is exactly right. This is exactly where I want to be. I thought about that a lot in those months, the certainty in her voice, the way she had always known things about the house, about the kids, about me in ways I did not fully appreciate until she was not there to know them anymore. I thought about the morning she asked me not to cut Derek off, the clarity in her eyes, the careful weight of what she asked. I thought I understood why she had done it. I thought I understood everything about that morning. I was wrong about that. I was wrong in a way that took another 1.5 years to fully reveal itself. And when it did, it revealed itself in the worst possible way, in front of people I had known my entire life. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, when a man named Bill Dooley knocked on my front door with a look on his face that I recognized immediately. It was the same look Gerald Perkins had in his voice on the phone 18 months earlier, except this time it was worse. This time there were more people involved. And this time Maggie was not upstairs to call my name. I opened the door and looked at Bill Dooley standing on my porch in the October cold. And I knew before he said a word that the thing I had been half watching for, half dreading for 1.5 years, had finally arrived. I told him to come inside. He came in, and he told me what he had to tell me. And I sat in my chair and listened to every word and did not interrupt him once. And when he was finished, I thanked him for coming to me directly. Then I sat alone in my living room for a very long time, looking at the lamp on the mantel, understanding finally and completely that some things cannot be held together no matter how hard you try, no matter what you promised, no matter who you promised it to. Bill Dooley was 64 years old and had worked 30 years at the same hardware store on Main Street before the owner retired and closed it down. After that, he had done odd jobs around town, fixing things for people, helping out where he could. He was the kind of man who knew everybody and was trusted by everybody, which in a small town like Harlan Hollow meant something real and specific. His word carried weight. When Bill Dooley told you something, you believed it. He sat in the chair across from me, the chair Claire usually sat in when she visited, and he turned his cap in his hands, the way men do when they have something hard to say and are not sure how to begin. I waited. I had learned a long time ago that rushing a man through something difficult does not make the difficult thing smaller. It just makes the telling worse. He started by saying he was sorry. He said it twice, which told me the thing he was about to say was bad enough that he felt he needed 2 apologies before he even got to it. Then he told me, over the past several months, Derek had been coming around Harlan Hollow more than I had known. Not visiting me, I had not seen Derek more than twice in the year since Maggie passed. He had been visiting other people, quietly, carefully, the way you visit people when you do not want word getting back to someone specific. He had been talking to men and women I had known for decades, people who had worked alongside me at the mine, people who had sat with us at church, people who had brought food to this house when Maggie died. He had been telling them about an investment opportunity, a fund of some kind, something to do with property development in the Charleston area. Good returns, low risk, limited spots available. The kind of language that sounds like careful financial planning when someone you trust is saying it. And the reason they trusted it was because of me. Derek had told them I was involved, not just aware of it involved, that I had put money in myself, that I had looked it over and felt good about it. Some of them he had told directly. Others he had simply implied it. Let the assumption sit there without correcting it. Either way, the result was the same. People who would not have given a stranger a second look had opened their checkbooks because Raymond Calloway's name was attached to it. Bill Dooley had put in $4,000. His neighbor Ruth Hensley had put in $2,500. A man named Carl Adkins, who had worked the same shift as me for 12 years underground, had put in $6,000. There were others. Bill did not know all the names yet, but he knew there were others. The fund had stopped responding to inquiries 2 weeks ago. Phone calls went unanswered. The website Derek had shown people had gone dark. Bill had driven to Charleston, and the address Derek had given him was a mail forwarding service in a strip mall with nothing behind it but an empty suite. I sat in my chair and listened to all of this without moving. When Bill finished, the room was very quiet. The fire was going in the fireplace. The lamp was on the mantel. Outside the window, the October sky was the color of cold metal. I asked Bill how many people total he thought were involved. He said he was not certain. Maybe 8 or 10 that he knew of. Possibly more. I asked him what the total amount might be. He said he thought it was somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000. Maybe more. I looked at the fire for a moment. Then I looked at Bill. I told him that I had not known, that I had not been involved in any way, that my name had been used without my knowledge or permission, the same way it had been used once before, 18 months earlier. Though that time had been smaller, and I had chosen to handle it privately out of respect for circumstances that no longer existed. Bill nodded. He said he had suspected as much. He said he had come to me directly rather than going to the sheriff, because he wanted to give me the chance to know first. I thanked him for that. I meant it. After he left, I sat in that chair for a long time. I did not move to the phone. I did not move to the window. I just sat there with the weight of what I had just heard settling down around me like coal dust after a blast, slow, thorough, covering everything. The people Derek had gone to were not wealthy people. In Harlan Hollow, nobody was particularly wealthy. $4,000 to Bill Dooley was not a trivial sum. $6,000 to Carl Adkins, a retired miner living on a pension not much bigger than mine, was a serious amount of money. These were people who had worked hard their whole lives and saved carefully and trusted the word of a man they had known since he was a boy because that man's father had given them no reason to do otherwise. That was what Derek had spent. Not just their money. He had spent the trust they had placed in me over 30, 40 years of living alongside each other in this small place where everyone knew everyone, and a man's reputation was one of the few things he could build and keep and pass on. He had spent all of that, and he had done it knowing exactly what he was doing. I thought about Maggie. I thought about her hand over mine, the bones in it, the clarity in her eyes. I thought about the promise I had made her and the way she had closed her eyes when I said all right. I thought about what she had known and what she had not known. I thought about what she would say if she were sitting in this room right now. I did not know the answer to that. I was not sure I wanted to. What I knew was this: the reason I had not cut Derek off 18 months ago was gone. The reason was buried on a hillside in the Harlan Hollow Cemetery, under a stone that said Margaret Louise Calloway, beloved wife and mother. The reason was gone, and the thing I had feared would happen had happened anyway. Bigger and worse, and more deliberate than before. I got up from the chair. I went to the kitchen. I took my evening inhaler and did my breathing exercises, slowly and carefully, because my chest was tight in a way that had nothing to do with coal dust and everything to do with what I had just heard. And I knew that if I did not take care of my lungs right now, they would not take care of me. 10 slow breaths in, hold for 4, 10 slow breaths out. I did it twice. Then I picked up the phone. Derek answered on the second ring. That surprised me. A little. I had half expected him not to answer at all. But he picked up, and when he heard my voice, he said, "Hey, Dad," the same way he always did. And for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, I thought about how strange it was that a person could do what he had done and still answer the phone that way. Still use that same easy, familiar tone, like nothing had changed. Like Bill Dooley had not just sat in my living room, turning his cap in his hands. I did not give him time to say anything else. I told him Bill Dooley had come to see me. I told him I knew what he had done. I told him I knew about the investment fund, about the people he had approached, about the way he had used my name to make them trust him. I said all of it in one steady sequence, without raising my voice, without pausing to let him respond, because I wanted him to understand that I was not calling to have a conversation. I was not calling to hear his explanation. I was calling because there were things that needed to be said, and I was going to say them. When I stopped, Derek was quiet for a moment. Then he started talking. He said it was not what it looked like. He said the fund was real, that the investment was real, that something had gone wrong with the timing and he was working on getting everyone their money back. He said he had never meant for anyone to get hurt. He said he had only used my name because he knew people in Harlan Hollow would not listen to him otherwise. That he had needed a way in. That he had planned to repay everyone before anyone even noticed. I listened to all of it. Then I told him something I had been turning over in my mind since Bill Dooley walked out my door. I told Derek that I had made a promise to his mother 18 months ago. That she had asked me, from her sickbed, to keep the family together. That I had sat beside her and held her hand and said, "All right, Maggie," and I had meant it. I had kept that promise for a year and a half. I had answered his phone calls. I had sat across from him at Thanksgiving. I had done all of it because I had given my word to the woman I loved more than anything else in my life. I told him that woman was gone now, and that the promise I made to her did not extend to this. That she had asked me to keep the family together, not to keep absorbing the consequences of his choices indefinitely. That she had asked me to give him a chance, and I had given him a chance. And he had used that chance to do something worse than the first thing. Not better. I told him I was done, not angry, the way I might have been when I was younger. Not loud, just done. The way a man is done when he has reached the end of something and there is simply nothing left on the other side of the line. Derek said my name. He said, "Dad, come on." He said other things that I did not fully process because by then I had already made my decision and the words were moving past me without finding any purchase. I told him not to contact me again unless it was to tell me he had repaid every person he had taken money from. Every single one. Full amount. No excuses. No partial payments. No promises of future repayment. Every dollar. Every person. Made whole. Then I told him to take care of himself. Because even then, even at that moment, he was still my son. And some part of me that existed below anger and below disappointment and below everything else still felt that. Still felt the weight of it. I hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a while after that. Not doing anything in particular. The kitchen was quiet. The house was quiet. Outside the window, the last of the light was going off the mountain. That particular shade of gray that October evenings bring to the hills of West Virginia. And I stood there watching it and breathing carefully and thinking about nothing very specific, just letting the feeling of what I had done settle into me. It felt like putting down something very heavy that I had been carrying for a long time. It also felt like loss. Both things at once. Which is how most of the real things in life feel if you are honest about them. I made myself something to eat that evening, though I was not particularly hungry. I sat at the kitchen table and ate and looked at the lamp on the mantel in the next room. I had lit the fire earlier, and the light from it caught the old glass of the lamp in a way that made it glow faintly, like there was still something alive in it. I thought about all the mornings that lamp had gone down into the dark with me. All the shifts, all the tunnels, all the years of bending low and moving through spaces that were not made for a man to stand upright in. I had never been afraid down there, not in any serious way. Other men were afraid, some of them badly enough that they quit, walked off the job and never went back. I understood why. The weight of the earth above you is not an abstract thing when you are inside it. You feel it. You know it is there, but I had never been afraid of it. I had always trusted the structure, trusted that if you paid attention, if you watched for the signs, if you did the work properly and did not take shortcuts, you could move through that darkness and come back out on the other side. I had tried to apply that same logic to my family. Pay attention. Watch for the signs. Do not take shortcuts. Trust the structure. The structure had not held. I washed my dish and put it away and went to bed early. My lungs were tight and my chest ached in a dull, persistent way that I recognized as the physical expression of stress that Dr. Paulson had warned me about. I took my evening inhaler and lay in the dark, doing my breathing exercises until the tightness eased enough to let me sleep. I did not sleep well, but I slept. Word got around Harlan Hollow the way word always gets around in a small town, not all at once. Not through any single channel, but gradually. Through the accumulated weight of small conversations in the hardware store and the diner and the parking lot of the church on Sunday morning. People talked. They were careful about it. Most of them careful the way people are when they respect someone and are not sure how much of the truth to say out loud. But they talked. Within 2 weeks of Bill Dooley's visit, I had heard from 3 more people who had given Derek money. Carl Adkins called me himself, which took courage, because Carl was a proud man, and calling a friend to say you had been taken advantage of is not an easy thing. I told Carl what I had told Bill that I had not known, that my name had been used without my permission, that I was deeply sorry. Carl said he knew that. He said he just wanted me to hear it from him directly, man to man. I appreciated that more than I could say. Ruth Hensley sent her son over with a note. The note said she did not blame me and hoped I was keeping well. That note sat on my kitchen table for several days before I finally put it in the drawer. Some things are too generous to look at for very long. There was one encounter that was harder than the others. A woman named Patsy Greer, who had been in Maggie's Bible study group for 15 years, stopped me in the parking lot of the grocery store one afternoon. She was a small woman, 70s, white-haired, the kind of woman who had always reminded me a little of my own mother. She looked at me for a moment without saying anything, and then she said, "Raymond, I am so sorry this happened to you. Not, I am sorry he did this. Not, I am sorry about the money. I am sorry this happened to you." I stood in that parking lot in the cold October air, with my lungs aching and my eyes stinging in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. And I told her thank you, Patsy. And I got in my truck, and I drove home. I sat in the truck in my own driveway for about 10 minutes before I went inside. I am not a man who cries easily. I was not crying. But there are moments that come close enough to it that the distinction starts to feel unimportant. What Patsy Greer understood, without me having to explain it, was that what Derek had taken from me was not money. I had not lost a single dollar in what he had done. My name had been used, but my bank account had not been touched. What he had taken was something that could not be replaced or repaid. The ease with which I could walk into any room in Harlan Hollow and be simply Ray Calloway, a man people knew and trusted. That ease was gone now. In its place was something more complicated, something that required explaining and explanation. Even when people believe you, leaves a residue. I had never had to explain myself in this town. Not once in 68 years. Claire called that evening. She had heard what was happening. I did not know how, exactly, whether through me or through someone else. But she had heard. She asked how I was doing. I told her I was managing. She asked if she could come down for a few days, and I told her she did not need to do that. She said she was coming anyway, and I said all right. She arrived 2 days later with groceries and a look on her face that was her mother's look, that particular combination of concern and determination that Maggie had always worn when she had decided to take care of something and was not going to be talked out of it. Claire had grown into that expression over the past couple of years, since Maggie passed. I noticed it more and more. She cooked dinner that first evening, and we sat at the kitchen table and talked about practical things, my medications, my next appointment with Dr. Paulson, whether the furnace needed servicing before the real cold set in. We did not talk about Derek directly. We circled around it the way you circle around something that is too large to approach head-on. After dinner, I went to the living room and sat in my chair. Claire washed the dishes, and when she was done, she came and sat on the couch near the fireplace. We sat for a while without speaking. The fire was going. The lamp was on the mantel. She looked at the lamp for a moment. Then she looked at me. She said, "Bia, I need to tell you something." I looked at her. There was something in her voice I had not heard before, or perhaps something I had heard before and not identified correctly. A weight to it. A careful quality. Like she was carrying something she had been carrying for a long time and was finally deciding to set down. I told her to go ahead. She said, "Not yet." She said she needed to think about how to say it. She said it was something that could not be unsaid once it was said, and she wanted to be sure the time was right. I looked at my daughter sitting there in the firelight with her mother's eyes and her mother's expression of careful determination, and I felt something move through me that I could not quite name. Not dread, exactly. Something more complicated than dread. Something that was partly dread and partly the particular feeling of a man who has been sensing for a long time that there is more to a story than he has been told, and is now standing at the edge of finding out what that more is. I told her to take her time. She nodded. She looked at the fire. My lungs ached. The house was warm. Outside, the October wind was moving through the bare trees on the mountain, and the sound of it came through the walls faintly, like breathing. I waited. Claire did not tell me that night. She came close. She sat there for a long time looking at the fire, and I could see her working up to it. Could see the words forming and then pulling back. Finally, she said she was tired from the drive, and that she would tell me tomorrow. I told her that was fine. She went to bed, and I sat alone for another hour before I did the same. The next morning I was up before dawn as usual. By the time Claire came downstairs, I had the coffee made and my breathing exercises done, and I was standing at the kitchen window watching the light come over the mountain. She poured herself a cup and sat at the table, and we were quiet together for a while. The way we had learned to be quiet together during those long months when Maggie was sick, and words were often less useful than simply being present. After a while, she said, "I want to tell you what Mom told me. But first I need you to understand something. She made me promise not to tell you while she was still alive. She said she needed to be the one to decide when and whether you found out. She died before she decided, and I have been sitting with this ever since." I turned from the window and looked at my daughter. She was holding her coffee cup with both hands, the way Maggie used to hold hers. She was 36 years old, and she looked young to me and old to me at the same time, the way your children sometimes do when you see them clearly. I told her I was listening. She set her cup down. She looked at the table for a moment, then at me. She said that about 3 weeks before Gerald Perkins called me, so about 5 weeks before Maggie died, Derek had come to visit alone. On a weekday, without Sandra, without the kids. He had told me he was coming. I remembered that visit. I had been in town getting groceries when he arrived, and Maggie had been alone in the house with him for almost 2 hours before I got back. I had not thought much about that at the time. Maggie and Derek had always been close. A visit alone was not unusual. What I had not known was what happened during those 2 hours. Derek had sat with his mother and told her something he had never told me. He had told her that the loan from Gerald Perkins was not the first time he had used my name without permission. That there had been something before it, something that had happened the previous year, when Maggie was still well enough to be up and moving around. When neither of us had been paying close attention to what Derek was doing in his own financial life because we had assumed, as parents do, that a man in his 40s was managing his own affairs. Derek had accessed money from an account that Maggie and I held jointly at the bank in Beckley. Not a large account, we had never been wealthy people, but it was money we had saved carefully over many years. Money set aside for exactly the kind of emergencies and medical costs that Maggie's illness had been generating. He had not taken all of it. He had taken a portion. Claire said Derek had told Maggie the amount was around $8,000, and he had replaced most of it over the following months. Replaced enough that the balance, when I had checked it, had not raised any alarm. The discrepancy had been small enough to attribute to expenses I had perhaps miscounted. He had told Maggie all of this. He had sat beside his dying mother and confessed it to her. And then he had asked her not to tell me. He had told her he was ashamed. He told her he had been in trouble. Financial trouble he had not wanted to admit to anyone, and he had made a decision he knew was wrong, and he had fixed it as much as he could, and he was asking her to let it stay buried. He had said that if I found out, I would cut him off completely, and he knew it. And he could not lose his father on top of everything else he was dealing with. Maggie had listened to all of it. And then she had called Claire into the room. She had told Claire everything Derek had just told her. She had done it in front of Derek, who sat there and did not say a word. And then she had told Claire that she was not going to tell Ray, that she had thought about it carefully, and she had decided that telling me would accomplish nothing except to destroy what remained of the relationship between a father and son. And she did not have enough time left to watch that happen, and she was not willing to spend her remaining days in the middle of it. She had told Claire that she knew this was not fair to me. She had said those words exactly, according to Claire. She had said, "I know this is not fair to your father, but I am asking you to let me make this choice. And when I am gone, you will have to decide for yourself whether to tell him. I cannot make that decision for you. I can only tell you what I need right now." Claire had agreed, not because she thought it was the right thing, because her mother was dying and her mother was asking, and there are certain requests you cannot refuse from a person who has very little time left to make them. When Claire finished telling me all of this, the kitchen was very quiet. I had not moved from where I was standing. I was still at the window, one hand on the counter, the morning light coming in flat and gray through the glass. I thought about the morning Maggie had asked me to forgive Derek, the clarity in her eyes, the hand over mine, the way she had said, I know what you have decided, and I am not going to tell you that you are wrong." She had known more than she said that morning. She had known the full story. She had heard it from Derek's own mouth 3 weeks before Gerald Perkins ever called me, and she had decided, deliberately and with full understanding of what she was doing, to tell me only part of it. Enough to make my choice possible. Not enough to make it impossible. She had shaped the decision I made. She had put her hand over mine and asked me to forgive her son. And she had done it knowing things she had chosen not to share with me. I stood at the window and thought about that for a long time. Claire was watching me. She did not say anything. She was giving me the room to have whatever reaction I was going to have without having to manage it for her at the same time. I appreciated that. She was good at that. She had learned it from her mother, which was either a comfort or an irony, and I could not decide which. Finally, I said, "She should have told me," Claire said. "I know." Then after a moment I said, "But I understand why she did not." And that was the hardest part. Not the anger was there, somewhere underneath. But it was not the loudest thing. The loudest thing was the understanding. The terrible, unwanted understanding of why a woman who loved her husband had looked him in the eye and told him only part of the truth. And how love and deception could live in the same act without canceling each other out. I pushed off the counter and went to the table and sat down. I picked up my coffee cup. It had gone cold. Claire reached across the table and put her hand over mine. It was exactly what her mother had done. In that room. In that bed. On that February morning. I looked at my daughter's hand on mine, and I thought about all the things that get passed down in a family without anyone meaning to pass them on. Claire stayed 4 days that time. 4 days of quiet mornings and careful meals, and the two of us moving around each other in this house the way people do when they are both carrying something heavy and have agreed, without saying it out loud, to carry it separately for a while before trying to talk about it again. She did the grocery shopping. She fixed the loose hinge on the back door that I had been meaning to get to for months. She sat with me in the evenings by the fire, and sometimes we talked about small things, the weather, her job back in Morgantown, a book she had been reading, and sometimes we did not talk at all, the morning she left. She stood at the door with her bag over her shoulder and looked at me the way she had been looking at me for 4 days. That careful, watchful look. I had come to understand it was her way of checking whether I was still standing. I told her I was fine. She said she knew. Then she said she was going to call every evening and I was going to answer, and I said all right. She hugged me the way she always had since she was small completely, without reservation, which she had gotten from Maggie and not from me, and then she drove away, and I stood at the door and watched her taillights disappear around the bend in the road. Then I went inside and sat in my chair. The house was quiet again. The particular quiet of a place that has had someone in it and then does not. I had gotten used to that quiet over the past 2 years, had learned to live inside it without letting it become something heavier than it needed to be. But that morning it felt different. It felt like the quiet had more in it than usual, like it was full of things that had been said and things that had not been said and things that could not be unsaid now even if I wanted them to be. I thought about what Claire had told me. I had been thinking about it for 4 days. Of course. It had not left me for more than a few minutes at a stretch since that morning in the kitchen when she told me. But I had not let myself think about it fully, directly. The way you sometimes have to wait until you are alone to look at something that is too difficult to examine in front of another person. Now I was alone. Now I could look at it. The thing about learning a truth late is that it does not simply replace what you believed before. It sits alongside the old version of events and forces you to hold both at the same time. I had believed, for a year and a half, that I understood what had happened in the winter of 2018 and 19. I had believed I knew why Maggie asked what she asked. I had believed I was making an informed choice when I said all right. Maggie, when I held her hand and looked at the winter light through the window and gave her what she was asking for, now I knew that the choice I had made was built on a story that was not complete. Not false. Derek had done what Maggie told me he had done, and she had asked what she asked, and I had answered the way I answered. None of that was false. But underneath the surface of that February morning, there had been more. There had been $8,000 taken from a joint account before Gerald Perkins ever called. There had been a private confession from a son to his dying mother. There had been a deliberate decision made by that mother with full knowledge of what she was doing to tell me enough to make forgiveness possible and not enough to make it impossible. I had married a woman who was capable of that. I had known her for 40 years, and I had not fully known that about her. Or perhaps I had known it and called it something else. Called it her stillness. Called it strength. Maybe it was all of those things. Maybe the truth was that people are more complicated than the words we use to describe them. And the woman I had loved for 40 years was no exception to that. And the fact that I was only understanding this now, 2 years after she was gone, was simply the particular cruelty of loss. That it keeps teaching you things about the person you lost long after you have lost the ability to talk to them about what you are learning. I sat in my chair for a long time that morning. My lungs were quiet, which was not always the case. Some mornings they gave me no peace at all, and some mornings they settled into something almost comfortable. And that morning was one of the latter, which I was grateful for because I needed my mind clear, and the coughing made it hard to think straight. After a while I got up and went to the mantel and stood in front of the lamp. I had done this before, at various points in the past 2 years. Stood in front of it the way you stand in front of something that means more than it looks like it means. I did not touch it. I just looked at it. 35 years underground. 35 years of going down into the dark and trusting that the structure would hold. Trusting the timber supports and the ventilation systems and the careful work of men who had built those tunnels to keep other men alive in a place that was not designed for living. The trust was never blind. You checked the timbers every shift. You listened to the sounds the rock made. Because rock makes sounds when it is under stress. When something is shifting that should not be shifting. You learn to read those sounds. You learn to know the difference between settling that was normal and settling that meant something was about to give way. I had not read the sounds correctly with Derek. Or perhaps I had read them and chosen to call them something other than what they were. I was not sure which. I was not sure it mattered anymore. What mattered was where I was now. I went back to my chair. I picked up my coffee cup. It had gone cold again. I was always letting my coffee go cold. Had done it for years. Maggie used to shake her head at it and heat it up for me without being asked. And I drank it cold because that was what it was, and there was no point in wanting it to be something different. Outside the window, the mountain was gray and still. November had arrived while I was not paying attention, the way November always does in West Virginia, quietly, completely, stripping the last color out of the world before the snow comes to cover what is left. I thought about what I was going to do with the rest of the day. Then I thought about what I was going to do with the rest of my life. The two questions felt similar in size that morning. I was not sure what to make of that. Dr. Paulson came by the following week. He did his regular checks, listened to my lungs, checked my blood pressure, reviewed my medication log. His face did what doctors' faces do when they are trying to stay neutral while not loving what they are seeing. I had gotten good at reading that face over the past 3 years. He told me my lung function had decreased since the last measurement. Not dramatically, but measurably. He said the rate of decrease was faster than he would like to see. He asked me about my stress levels. I told him they had been elevated recently. He asked if I wanted to talk about it. I told him no. He nodded. He did not push. He adjusted one of my medications, gave me instructions about keeping the house warm, limiting my time outside in the cold, and told me he wanted to see me again in 6 weeks instead of the usual 8. After he left, I stood in the kitchen looking at the new medication bottles lined up on the counter. Faster than he would like to see. I turned those words over in my mind for a while without flinching from them. I had never been a man who flinched from plain facts. The fact was plain enough. I was 68 years old with black lung, living alone in a cold house in the mountains of West Virginia, and the stress of the past several weeks had done to my lungs what stress does to damaged lungs. This was cause and effect. Most things in life are cause and effect if you are willing to look at them honestly. I started being more deliberate about the routine Dr. Paulson and I had established. Morning breathing exercises, longer now, 15 minutes instead of 10. 10 slow breaths in. Hold for 4 counts. 10 slow breaths out. Medications on a strict schedule. An afternoon walk when the air was not too cold. Just to the end of the road and back enough to keep my body moving without pushing my lungs past what they could manage. Early to bed. The walks were new. I had not been walking regularly before, had not been able to find the motivation to walk by myself through a town that now felt different to me in ways I was still adjusting to. But Dr. Paulson said gentle movement was important, and I trusted him. So I walked. Harlan Hollow in November is not a cheerful place to walk. The streets are quiet. The storefronts that are still open have their lights on, but their doors closed against the cold. The mountains loom darker than they do in summer, stripped of their green, showing the gray rock underneath. The sky is usually the color of old metal. I had lived here my entire life. I had worked in the earth beneath these mountains for 35 years. I knew this place the way you know a face you have looked at every day for decades, not perfectly, not completely, but with a familiarity that goes past seeing into something closer to feeling. Walking through it in those November afternoons, I felt it differently than I had before. Not worse, just differently. Like something had shifted in the way I understood my place here. I had always been Ray Calloway of Harlan Hollow, not a wealthy man, not an important man in any grand sense, but a man who belonged here, who was part of the fabric of this place, the way the old families always are in small towns. That sense of belonging had been, without my ever consciously naming it, one of the steady foundations of my life. Derek had done something to that foundation, not destroyed it, Bill Dooley and Carl Adkins and Patsy Greer and Ruth Hensley's note in my kitchen drawer had made clear that my standing here was not as damaged as it had felt in those first weeks. People knew me. People knew the difference between what I had done and what my son had done. They were not holding it against me. But knowing that intellectually and feeling it in your body as you walk are two different things. The knowledge was there. The ease was still finding its way back. I was not going to push it. I walked and I breathed, and I counted my steps when my mind needed something simple to hold on to. And gradually, day by day, November moved through itself the way months do whether you are ready for them or not. Claire called every evening, as she had promised. The calls were not long, 15 or 20 minutes most nights. We talked about her day and mine, about small things, and sometimes about Maggie, about specific memories. The way you do when grief has moved past the raw stage into something more livable. Those conversations about Maggie were good ones. I looked forward to them more than I admitted. We did not talk much about Derek. There was not much left to say. I had said what I needed to say to him. He had not called since. Part of me had thought he might try some other avenue, through Sandra or the grandchildren, some approach that was harder to close off than a direct call. He had not. Either he understood that I meant what I said, or he was dealing with his own consequences now and did not have the energy for it. I did not know which. I did not spend much time wondering. What I did spend time thinking about in those November afternoons and evenings was Maggie. Not the way I had thought about her in the early grief when the wondering was mostly about her absence. The specific textures of daily life she had occupied that were now empty. That kind of grief had quieted over 2 years. What I thought about now was different, more specific. It was about the woman herself, the particular choices she had made in those final weeks. The particular calculation she had run in her mind when she decided what to tell me and what not to tell me. I had told Claire that I understood why Maggie had done it. And I did understand it. In the way you can understand something before you have fully made peace with it. The understanding and the peace were two different things. And I was working on the second one in the slow, patient way. That was the only way I knew how to work on anything. What helped, strangely, was not focusing on that February morning, but on all the other mornings, all the years of them. The woman who had stood at the kitchen window and said, "This is exactly right." The woman who had sat beside me through 35 years of hard work and tight money and the ordinary difficulties of a life lived in a small place, and who had never once made me feel she wanted something other than what we had. That woman had also made a decision in her final weeks that was not entirely honest with me. Both things were true. The woman who loved me deeply and the woman who had shaped the truth to protect the outcome she wanted, those were not two different women. They were the same woman. And I had loved her for 40 years without knowing the full picture, which meant that what I had loved was real even if the picture was incomplete. That was what I kept coming back to. Not the deception, the love underneath it. The love that had motivated the deception. Both real, both true, both hers. I was still working out what to do with all of that. I suspected I would be working it out for a long time. December came, and with it the first snow of the season, a light covering that arrived overnight and turned the mountain white by morning. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee and watched it the way snow demands to be watched. And I thought about how many December mornings I had stood at this same window with Maggie beside me, and how she had loved the first snow every year with a freshness that never diminished, calling for whoever was in the house to come and look, as if it might not happen again. I used to tease her gently about it. I missed that more than I could easily say. Claire came down for Christmas. She arrived on the 23rd, and we had Christmas the way Maggie and I had always had it, quietly, simply, with a small tree in the corner, and good food and no fuss. On Christmas morning, we sat by the fire with our coffee, and she gave me a book she thought I would like. And I gave her a quilt that had been her grandmother's, Maggie's mother's, that I had found in the cedar chest in the bedroom, and thought she should have. She held it for a long time before she said anything. Then she said it was perfect. That was all. But the way she said it was enough. It was a good Christmas. Not the same as the ones before. Nothing was the same as the ones before. And I had stopped expecting sameness. But good in its own right. Warm in the particular way a house is warm when someone you love is in it. We talked about Derek once, on Christmas Eve. Claire said she had not heard from him. I said I had not either. We left it there. Neither of us had anything useful to add. What we talked about more, sitting by the fire with the snow coming down outside, was Maggie. Claire told me small things she had collected over the years, details about her mother that children gather without knowing they are gathering them. And then she told me something I had not known. She said Maggie had kept a journal for years. Not a diary exactly, more like a notebook where she wrote down things she wanted to remember. Lines from books. Things the kids had said when they were small. Observations about the seasons. Recipes she had changed and wanted to keep track of. Claire had found it after Maggie passed. She had kept it. I did not know Maggie had kept a journal. 40 years together, and I had not known. Claire asked if I wanted to read it. I thought about it. Then I said not yet. That I would know when I was ready, and I was not ready yet. She said it would be there when I was. After she left on the 27th, I put the house back in order and sat in my chair in the quiet and thought about that journal sitting in Claire's apartment in Morgantown, full of Maggie's handwriting, full of things I did not yet know about the woman I had spent my life beside. There was something frightening and comforting about that in equal measure. Frightening because I did not know what I would find. Comforting because it meant there was still more of her to know. That some part of her thinking, her noticing, her inner life, still existed in the world in a form I could reach. I was not ready yet, but I thought about it. More nights than not. I thought about it. January arrived with the severity that January brings to the mountains: hard cold, heavy snow, days when the world outside was white and still and the sky was the color of iron. I kept to my routine: morning exercises, medications on schedule, the afternoon walk with the scarf pulled up over my mouth, the evening call from Claire. My lungs had stabilized somewhat. Not improved, stabilized. Dr. Paulson said this at my 6-week appointment with the careful neutrality of a man who considers stabilization a victory under the circumstances. I supposed he was right. I had been taking better care of myself, managing the physical effects of stress more deliberately, which amounted to the same thing from the lungs' point of view. The stress itself had not gone away. It had just changed shape. The sharp, acute weight of those first weeks after Bill Dooley's visit had softened into something more diffuse, a low-level pressure that I carried in my chest, that was not entirely the black lung, and not entirely the grief, and not entirely the situation with Derek, but some combination of all three that I had stopped trying to separate into its component parts. You carry what you carry. That is the whole of it. I thought about Derek sometimes, during those January walks. Not with anger, the anger had burned down to something cooler and more settled in the months since the phone call. I thought about him the way you think about a road you know you will not travel again. Not with hatred, with a kind of sad, clear-eyed recognition. He was my son. He would always be my son. That was not going to change. But a father's love and a father's willingness to remain in contact are not the same thing, and I had learned slowly, at considerable cost, that they could exist separately. That you could love someone and still understand that being near them required more than you had left to give. I had given enough. I had a quiet house and a daughter who called every evening and a lamp on the mantel and a journal I was not yet ready to read. That was what I had. It was enough to work with. It was on a Tuesday afternoon in late January, during my walk, that I ran into Carl Adkins. He was coming out of his driveway in his heavy coat, heading to his truck, and he stopped when he saw me and raised a hand. I raised mine. He stood for a moment, then walked over. We had not spoken since the phone call in October, the one where he had called to tell me, man to man, what Derek had done. That call had been brief and difficult, and we had gotten through it with our dignity intact, which was the most you could ask of a conversation like that. He stood in front of me on the cold road and looked at me for a moment without speaking. Carl was a big man, built for the mine, still carrying the physical imprint of that work even years after retirement. His face was weathered and serious. He said, "Ray, how you holding up?" I told him I was holding up. I asked him the same. He said, "Fine, fine." Then he was quiet. Then he said, "I want you to know something. What happened with your boy that does not change anything between you and me?" Not a thing. I looked at him. Carl Adkins was not a man who said things he did not mean. He had not been. In the 30 years I had known him. I told him I appreciated that more than he knew. He nodded, said he figured. Then he shook my hand, a real handshake, firm and brief, and got in his truck and drove toward Beckley. I stood on the road for a moment after he left. The cold air was still around me. The church steeple was visible through the bare trees. The mountain rose behind the town the way it always had and would long after all of us were gone. I breathed carefully, in through the nose, slow and controlled, out through pursed lips, slower still. The cold stung, but my lungs held. I turned and walked back toward the house. February came, and with it the 2-year mark of the last real conversation I had with Maggie. Not her death that was April, but the conversation in that room, with her hand over mine, with the clarity in her eyes. The conversation I now understood differently than I had when I was living it. I had been turning that morning over in my mind for months now, trying to see it from her side, trying to understand what she had been weighing, what she had decided she could not afford to lose in whatever time she had left. And I had arrived, slowly and without any single moment of clarity. at something I would not quite call peace, but that was perhaps the step just before it. A settled understanding. Not agreement. I still believed she should have told me the full truth. That had not changed. But the anger living inside that belief had quieted, replaced by something more complicated and more human. She had been dying. She had been using her remaining strength to hold together the things she loved most. She had made choices that were not fair to me, and she had known they were not fair. She had said exactly that to Claire. I know this is not fair to your father, and she had made them anyway, because she had decided that what she needed in those final weeks was worth more than my right to the complete picture. Was that wrong? I had gone back and forth on the question enough times that it had stopped yielding a clean answer. What I had arrived at instead was this. It was human. It was what a person does when they are out of time and love the people around them and are trying to make the ending as bearable as they can. It was not the choice I would have made, but I could understand it. And understanding it, even without agreeing with it, was the only kind of peace available to me now that she was gone, and there was no one left to have the actual conversation with. There was no point in being angry at a woman who was no longer in the world to hear the anger. What would it accomplish? The anger would just curl inward and make things worse. And my lungs did not need that. And my life did not need that. On the morning of that February anniversary, I called Claire before I even finished my coffee. She answered on the first ring, which told me she had been thinking about the date, too. We talked for a long time that morning, longer than our usual evening calls. We talked about Maggie's specific memories, some funny, some sad, some that were both at once. And then Claire said she wanted to read me something from the journal. A short entry, she said, from sometime in the mid-90s. She read it slowly, the way you read something that belongs to someone else. Maggie had written about watching me come home from a shift. She had written about me coming up the driveway covered in coal dust, moving slowly the way men move when they are deeply tired, but moving steadily, the way I always had. She had written that she thought I was the most quietly brave person she had ever known, that she watched me every evening and thought that and never said it. She had written that she hoped I understood how much she loved me. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to Claire read those words, and did not say anything for a long moment after she finished. Then I told Claire I was ready to read the journal. She said she would bring it on her next visit. After I hung up, I stayed at the table a long time. The coffee had gone cold. I left it. Through the window, the snow lay deep and white and still, the mountain rising into a white sky. The world holding its breath the way only February mornings in West Virginia can hold it completely. As if time itself has agreed to stop for a few minutes and let you catch up. I was a 68-year-old man with damaged lungs, sitting alone in the house where I had lived for 30 years. 2 years past the death of my wife. My son gone from my life for the second and final time. My daughter calling every evening from Morgantown, about to bring me a journal full of the inner life of a woman I had loved for 40 years and thought I had known completely. I looked at all of that plainly, without flinching, without wishing it were something other than what it was. I was diminished in some ways, older than I had felt a year ago, carrying things I had not carried before, but not destroyed, not even close to destroyed. I had gone down into the dark every morning for 35 years and come back up every time. And whatever the dark looked like now, whatever shape it had taken in this last stretch of my life, I did not intend to stop coming back up. The lamp on the mantel caught the white winter light coming through the window and held it for a moment. The old clouded glass glowing faintly, the way it sometimes did when the light was exactly right. I looked at it for a while. Then I got up, rinsed my cup, put on my coat, pulled the scarf up over my mouth, and went out for my walk. The February cold came at me immediately dense and committed, the kind that settles into you before you have finished your first breath. I breathed carefully, keeping the scarf close, taking small, measured breaths. My lungs protested for a minute, the way they always did, and then found their rhythm and held. I walked to the end of the road. I stood at the curve where you can see down into the lower part of town, the church steeple above the bare trees, the handful of cars on Main Street, the mountains holding everything in their gray and white embrace, the way they had held everything here since long before any of us arrived, and would go on holding it long after we were gone. I had been born in sight of these mountains. I had worked in the earth beneath them. I had built a life in their shadow, raised 2 children, buried a wife, and come through the hardest year of my adult life still standing on this road in the cold, breathing carefully, watching the town I had always lived in go about its Tuesday morning. That was something. I breathed in. I breathed out. Then I turned and walked back toward the house. Claire came back in March. She drove down on a Friday evening, arrived after dark, and when I opened the door, she was standing on the porch with her overnight bag over one shoulder and a small cardboard box under her other arm. The box was not big, about the size of a shoebox, maybe a little smaller. She held it carefully, the way you hold something that is not heavy but matters. I knew what it was before she said anything. I stepped back and let her in, and she set the box on the kitchen table while she took off her coat. I looked at the box but did not touch it. She made tea she had learned where everything was in this kitchen over the course of many visits, moved around it the way she moved around her own, and we sat at the table together and talked about her drive down, about the road conditions, about whether the weather was finally starting to turn towards spring. Small talk, necessary talk, the kind that gives 2 people time to settle into the same room before they get to the thing they are actually there for. After a while, the tea was done, and the small talk was done, and we sat quietly for a moment. Then Claire slid the box across the table toward me. I looked at it for a moment. Then I opened it. Inside, wrapped in a piece of cloth that I recognized as a section of an old curtain from the bedroom Maggie had always found uses for things, rather than throwing them away, was a notebook. Spiral-bound. The cover a faded blue-green. The corners worn soft from handling. It looked ordinary. It looked exactly like something Maggie would have chosen: practical, unassuming, not expensive. I picked it up and held it in both hands. Claire said she had read parts of it. Not all of it. She said some of it felt like it belonged to me and not to her. And she had stopped when she reached those parts. She said the entries went back to the early 90s, maybe even the late 80s, though the earliest ones were harder to date because Maggie had not always written the year, only the month and day. She said some entries were very short, just a sentence or 2, and some were longer. She said she thought I should read it alone, that she would go to bed and I could have the kitchen to myself. I told her she did not have to do that. She said she knew she did not have to. She said good night, and she went upstairs. I sat alone at the kitchen table with the notebook in my hands, and the lamp visible through the doorway on the mantel in the next room, and the house very quiet around me. I opened it to the first page. Maggie's handwriting was small and even, the kind of handwriting that people who learned to write carefully and kept that carefulness their whole lives. I had seen her handwriting on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the occasional note left on the kitchen counter, "Be back by 3. Dinner is in the oven. Call your mother," but I had never seen it in this quantity, in this density. Page after page of her hand moving across paper in the privacy of her own thoughts. It was strange and intimate in a way I had not anticipated. Like walking into a room of the house I had lived in for 30 years and finding a door I had never noticed before. I did not read it from the beginning that first night. I turned pages slowly, reading fragments, letting my eyes settle where they settled. An entry about a November storm, the power going out, the kids young enough that they thought it was an adventure. An entry about her own mother being sick a few years before she passed. An entry about a song she had heard on the radio driving back from Beckley. How it had made her cry without knowing exactly why. How she had sat in the car in the parking lot for a few minutes before she felt ready to go in and get the groceries. And then I found one about me. Not the one Claire had read on the phone, a different one. Undated. But from the paper and the quality of the ink, I thought it was probably from some time in the late 90s, when both kids were still home and I was still working full shifts at the Harlan No. 4. She had written about an evening in the spring. She had written that I had come home from a shift and sat at the dinner table so tired I could barely hold my fork, and that the kids had been talking over each other the way they did, and that I had sat there in the middle of all of it, with coal dust still in the creases of my hands I had washed, but I could never get it entirely out. Not those years, and I had listened to every word both of them said. She had written that she had watched me from the kitchen doorway and thought that I did not know how to say "I love you" in words, but that I had never missed a single thing that mattered to my children. Not one thing. And that this was its own kind of language, and she had learned to hear it a long time ago. I sat at the kitchen table and read that paragraph 3 times. Then I set the notebook down and looked at the wall for a while. I thought about all the evenings she was describing, the dinner table, the kids talking, the tiredness in my hands and my back and my lungs from a day underground. I remembered those evenings. I had not known she was watching me from the kitchen doorway and thinking those things. I had not known she had written them down. There is a particular kind of grief that arrives not in the early days, but later, when you are past the rawness and into the longer stretch of living with the loss. It arrives quietly, without warning. When you encounter something that shows you the full size of what you had, not just what you lost, but the depth of what was there that you did not fully see while it was in front of you. I sat with that grief for a while. I did not try to push it away or manage it or redirect it into something more comfortable. I just sat with it, the way I had learned to sit with difficult things still, patient, letting it be what it was. After a while, it shifted into something quieter, something that felt, if not quite like gratitude, then like the thing that lives next door to gratitude. The recognition that I had been given something real, that the life in those pages, the one she had watched and recorded and carried in her quiet way, had been my life too, and it had been worth recording. I closed the notebook carefully. I put it back in the box. I went to bed. I read the journal over the course of several weeks. Not all at once, a few pages at a time. Usually in the evenings after my breathing exercises and my dinner and my call with Claire. I read it the way you eat something that is both nourishing and rich slowly, with pauses. Because taking too much at once would have made it harder to absorb. There were entries that made me smile. Maggie had a dry sense of humor that she kept mostly to herself, and in the journal it came through clearly observations about neighbors, about the weather, about the particular absurdity of certain moments in family life that she had found funny without having anyone to share the joke with at the time. I had not known she found those things funny. I wished I had known. There were entries that were harder to read. Entries from when the kids were teenagers and going through the ordinary difficulties of that age in ways that had cost her more than she had ever let on. Entries from the year money was genuinely tight. When I had worried about it constantly, and she had worried in silence, not wanting to add her worry to mine, she had written about that silence, about choosing not to speak her fear, because she knew I was already carrying as much as I could carry, and she did not want to add weight. She had written, in an entry from that period, that she sometimes thought that her job in this marriage was to absorb things before they reached Ray, and that she did not always know whether that was love or something else. I sat with that entry for a long time. She had written those words without knowing I would ever read them. She had written them honestly, questioning herself, not arriving at a clean answer. I do not always know whether that was love or something else. I thought about that in relation to what she had done with the information Derek gave her in those final weeks. The pattern was not new, I realized. It had been there a long time, this instinct she had to absorb things before they reached me, to process them, to decide what I needed to know and what I did not. She had not invented it in the last weeks of her life. She had been doing it in smaller ways for decades, and I had not seen it because it had been invisible in the way that things are invisible when they are done quietly and with love and for your benefit. I did not know whether that made it better or worse. I suspected it made it simply more understandable, which was different from either. There was one entry near the end of the journal that I saved for last, because Claire had told me it was there and had said only that I should read it when I felt ready. It was from the winter of 2018, when Maggie was already sick enough to spend most of her time in bed. The handwriting was slightly different from the earlier entries, not dramatically, but I could see the effort in it. The way a person writes when holding a pen has become harder than it used to be. She had written about me. She had written that she had been watching me care for her, the medications, the meals, the way I sat beside her bed in the evenings, and that she had been thinking about what it meant that a man who did not know how to say certain things could fill a room with them just by being present in it. She had written that she knew I was angry about Derek, and that she knew she was going to ask me to forgive him, and that she knew it would cost me something I could not easily afford. She had written that she was going to ask me anyway, because she was dying and she was frightened, and the thought of leaving with her family broken apart was the thing she was most frightened of. She had written, and I read this sentence several times, that she knew this was selfish, and she was making her peace with being selfish, because she did not have enough time left to be anything else. And then she had written, "I hope he understands, someday, that everything I did was because I loved him. Even the things that were not fair, especially those." I sat in the kitchen with the journal open to that page for a long time. The evening was quiet. The fire was going in the next room. The lamp was on the mantel. Outside the window, March was doing what March does in West Virginia, changing its mind every few hours about whether it wanted to be winter or spring. The temperature swinging, a thin rain coming and going against the glass. I thought about the last 40 years, about the life we had built in this house, in this town, in this particular version of the world that was small and not especially remarkable by most measures, and had been entirely sufficient by mine. I thought about the woman who had stood at the kitchen window and said, "This is exactly right." I thought about the woman in the journal, the one who had watched me from the kitchen doorway and thought things she had not said, who had absorbed things before they reached me, who had made decisions in her final weeks that were not fair to me, and had known they were not fair, and had made them anyway out of love and fear and the particular urgency of someone who is out of time. Both of those women were the same woman, the one I had loved and the one I was still learning. They were the same, and I had loved her honestly even when the picture was incomplete, which meant that what we had was real even if it was not simple. I did not know whether I would ever stop grieving her. I thought probably not entirely, that some part of the grief would simply become part of me the way the coal dust had become part of my lungs, present and permanent, and worked into the tissue of things. You carry what you carry. You learn to breathe around it. What I knew was that reading her words had done something to the tangled thing inside me that had been sitting there since Claire told me the truth in October. Not untangled it entirely, some tangles do not come undone. They just loosen enough to live with, but loosened it, shifted it, given me a way to hold the difficult parts of what she had done alongside the full truth of who she was, and to understand that both were real, and that the love was bigger than the difficulty. I closed the journal. I held it in my hands for a moment. Then I carried it to the living room and set it on the mantel beside the lamp. Spring came slowly that year, the way it sometimes does in the mountains, reluctantly, in fits and starts, with cold nights long after the days had started to warm. But it came. By April, the trees on the mountain were showing green again, that particular pale green of early spring that is almost luminous against the gray rock. And the yard was soft underfoot, and the air in the mornings smelled like wet earth and something beginning. I noticed it more that year than I had in recent years. Perhaps because the winter had been long in ways that went past weather. Perhaps because I had been paying attention differently since I started walking every day, paying attention to the specific details of the place I lived in. The way you do when your body is moving through a landscape and your mind has space to actually see it. I had kept up the walking through all of February and March, even on the harder days, even when my lungs made me work for every breath in the cold. Dr. Paulson had noted at my last appointment that my lung function appeared to have stabilized more firmly than he had expected, given the previous readings. He said this carefully, the way he always did, not wanting to overstate it. But I heard what he was saying. The routine was helping. The deliberate care was doing what deliberate care does when you apply it consistently and without shortcuts over a long period of time. I was not going to get better. That was not what black lung does. It does not get better, only managed, only slowed. But I was not getting worse as fast as I had been. That was something. That was, in fact, a great deal. And I had learned to receive it as such without needing it to be more than it was. Claire came down in April for a few days, around the anniversary of Maggie's death. She arrived on a Wednesday, and we went together to the cemetery on the Thursday morning, the 5th of April. A clear, cool morning. The mountain visible above the tree line. The air clean and quiet the way April mornings can be when they decide to be generous. I had brought the lamp. Not permanently, I was not leaving it there. I just wanted to bring it. I was not entirely sure why, except that it felt right in the way that certain things feel right without yielding to explanation. I held it while we stood at the grave, the old black steel warm from my hands, the clouded glass catching the morning light. I thought about what Maggie had written. I hope he understands, someday, that everything I did was because I loved him, even the things that were not fair, especially those. Standing at her grave with the lamp in my hands, I thought I understand. Maggie, I do not agree with all of it, but I understand. I did not say it out loud. I did not need to. Some things you say inward, and they land where they need to land without needing air to carry them. Claire stood beside me without speaking. She had her mother's quality of knowing when silence was the right thing. After a while, she put her hand through my arm the way Maggie used to when we walked somewhere together, and we stood like that for a few more minutes. And then we walked back to the truck. On the drive home, I told Claire something I had been working towards saying for a while. I told her that I did not blame her for keeping the secret as long as she had. That I understood why she had agreed to what her mother asked. That it had been an impossible position for a 34-year-old woman to be put in, and that she had handled it as well as anyone could have, and that I was grateful she had told me when she did and not left it unspoken forever. Claire did not say anything for a moment. Then she said she had been afraid I was angry with her, that she had been carrying that fear since October. I told her no. I had never been angry with her. She looked out the window at the mountain going past, and I could see her shoulders come down from where she had been holding them. We had lunch at the house Claire cooked. Nothing elaborate, just soup and bread, and in the afternoon we sat on the back porch in the weak April sun, bundled in our coats, and talked. Really talked. The way we had not always managed to do in the harder months of the past winter. About Maggie, about the journal, about what it was like for Claire growing up in this house with the father she had, and the mother she had, and the brother she had. She told me things I had not known about her childhood. Small, true things that filled in parts of the picture I had not realized were missing. I told her things too, about the mine, about the early years with Maggie, about what it had felt like to be a young man trying to build something solid with nothing much to build with except his own willingness to work. She listened the way Maggie used to listen, completely, without impatience, letting the story arrive in its own time. It was a good afternoon, one of the better ones I had had in a long while. Before she left the next morning, she asked me about Derek. Not about whether I was going to change my mind, she knew better than to ask that. She asked, carefully, whether I was at peace with the decision. I thought about it for a moment. Then I told her yes, that I had not made the decision in anger, or not only in anger, that I had made it with the full understanding of who Derek was and what he had done and what it would mean going forward. That I did not carry hatred for him. That I carried something sadder and more permanent than hatred, a kind of final recognition that he was who he was, and I was who I was, and the distance between those two things was too wide to bridge. That I hoped he found his way to something better, whatever that looked like for him, but that I was not able to be part of that. And I had made my peace with being unable to. Claire nodded. She said she thought that was honest. I told her I had always tried to be. She hugged me at the door, the way she always did, completely and without reservation, and then she drove away, and I watched her taillights until the bend in the road took them. I went back inside. The house was quiet. The fire was going low, and I added a piece of wood and watched it catch. The lamp was back on the mantel where it belonged, beside the journal, the two of them sitting there in the firelight like two things that had always belonged together, even though they had arrived in my life by very different roads. I sat in my chair. The mountain was visible through the window, green now along the lower slopes, the early spring color luminous in the evening light. The birds had come back. I had been hearing them in the mornings, which was one of the reliable signs that the season had genuinely turned. Small things, reliable things. The kind that do not ask anything of you except that you notice them. I noticed them. I thought about the question Claire had asked, whether I was at peace with the decision about Derek. And I thought about the answer I had given. And I thought about whether it was true. It was true. Not the easy kind of true that comes from never having struggled with something. The kind that comes after a long time of struggling and arriving. Finally, at a place you can stand on. Not comfortable exactly, but solid. The kind of ground that holds you. I was 68 years old. My lungs were damaged and would remain damaged. My wife was gone and would remain gone. My son was out of my life, and I did not expect that to change. My daughter called every evening and would come when I needed her, and I would go to her when she needed me. And between those visits, we would carry on the way people carry on when they love each other across the ordinary distance of separate lives. That was the shape of things. I had looked at it plainly, without flinching, and I had found that I could live inside it. Not just survive it, live inside it. There was a difference between those two things, and I had come to understand that difference in the particular way you understand things you have had to earn. I reached over and picked up the lamp from the mantel, held it in my hands the way I had held it at the cemetery, the old black steel, the scratched surface, the clouded glass that had lit the way through 35 years of dark. I had said it before, and I said it again now, quietly, just to hear it settle in the room. There are certain things you carry up from underground, and there are certain things you never manage to bring up at all. I had carried up what I could carry. The rest I had left below. That was the most any man could do, and it had always been enough. And it was enough now. I set the lamp back on the mantel beside the journal. I did my breathing exercises 15 minutes, slow and deliberate, in through the nose, hold for 4, out through pursed lips. My lungs worked. Not easily. Not without effort. But they worked. And I was grateful for that in a way I had not always remembered to be. Then I went to the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee. And for once, I sat down and drank it while it was still hot. Outside the window, the mountain held the last of the evening light, green and gray and quietly immense, the way it had always been and would be long after the last of us was gone. The birds were still going somewhere in the trees. The yard was soft and alive after the long winter. The air coming through the cracked window smelled like wet earth and new leaves, and something that had no name except spring. I sat with my coffee in the quiet house, and I was all right. Not happy in any simple way. Not fixed. Not finished with the grief or the loss or the long, complicated work of understanding the people I had loved and the life I had lived. But all right in the way that matters most, present. Clear-eyed. Still standing. Still breathing. Still coming back up. If this story found its way into your day, I am glad for it. These are the kinds of stories that do not always get told, the quiet ones. The ones that happen in small houses in small towns. The ones about ordinary people trying to carry what life puts in their hands with as much grace as they can manage. If it meant something to you, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. A like, a subscription, those things help more than you might think. And they are appreciated more than I know how to say. God bless you, and take care of the people you love while you still can.